Alright YouTube, it's time for another occult video. With winter slowly entering that phase at which it's sort of waning towards spring, the snow fleas are now out in full effect. By the way, they don't actually bite. There's some sort of springtail or something that lives for like a fucking week or some shit like that. I thought it would be a good time to talk about another occult topic that I've been meaning to cover. It's extremely dense, there's a lot here, and I'm actually writing a book on this topic. I'm 20 pages into it now, on the nature of the dimensions of cycles as they relate to the spiritual world, although biology is involved. The lunar cycle, the solar cycle, how cultures cycle, everything cycles basically. And also one of the other important topics within this is that I pointed this out within linguistic anthropology, the going theory, and it makes sense, is that man primarily experiences the world in terms of opposites. That is, you wouldn't have a term or an understanding of the uniqueness of something like light unless you also understand darkness. They are considered opposing forces by man, and through that he understands the world. There's a necessity there to denote like versus unlike. This is operational within biology as well. Our brains are pre-programmed actually to see other living things, anything in terms of is it like self. We even have the capability to recognize facial patterns. In some people this is actually out of whack and they'll see faces everywhere, which is kind of creepy if you ask me, but like they'll be looking at wood grain and they'll see a bunch of faces gazing at them. That is a little bit strange. But the occult sort of explanation behind this, first to the lunar and solar cycles, I'm pointing this out in the work that I'm writing. We often think, from a spiritual perspective, from an occult perspective, and the New Agers do this too, we often look at the lunar cycle and the solar cycle as sort of like opposites. That's how we understand them in a spiritual way, not just a biological way. We say, well, the moon is sort of the lord of the night. You know, you think of nighttime, you think of the gentle moonlight coming down, which is really just reflected sunlight, which I also point out. And then the day is sort of the sun. Now the lunar is more the feminine. It's more the left-hand path aspect. It's the feminine force. Solar deities almost always seem to be male. There's a physical aspect to them. But there's a similarity too. They are both simply celestial bodies. The light involved is literally the same light. The sun is generating its own light. The moon does not. The moon reflects the sunlight. So they are actually twain. The idea that they're separate, I think, has more to do with man attempting to take his limited experience of reality and project it upon the spiritual world. What I point out is that actually they're kind of the same thing. There are opposing concepts within it. There are opposing spiritual metaphors behind it, but ultimately they are more similar than they are disparate, and it's in actually recognizing those similarities, the correlation between the physical and the cosmic, between the physical and the spiritual, that real magic, real occultism, real understanding and wisdom really takes hold, and this is something that most of these groups appear unable to do. They either regard, particularly like solar festivals, solar deities, typically male, typically omnipotent or something like that, like Jehovah. Or they recognize like feminine energies. They recognize the more naturalistic, the more blatantly spiritual. Within the New Age movement, this is no more evident other than within some of their materials, with the idea of the Illuminati, the solar, male force, above ground specifically, in Shambhala, and then Agartha, the luminary, the feminine, the more authentically spiritual. But I point this out, there can be no spiritual feminine energy without a physical body for it to act upon. The idea within the left-hand path in the Eastern sense about transcending the physical, to me, makes just as little sense as the idea of just a physical man divorced of all spirituality in a purely secular, sterile environment. Because a lot of those same philosophies informed that same secular physical existence. We see this with the founding of most of the Western world. The ideas of freedom and liberty are not strictly secular. The government was set up in a secular manner. However, there was an underlying spirituality behind this. Literally, they appealed to the concept that the Creator was the one primarily, which gave them their rights. Now, you can talk about whether this should have any legal basis all day long. The point is, that's what they said. Likewise, that same feminine, energetic, spiritual, sort of etheric force, that sort of mental plane or higher realm, the astral realm, the Akashic records, whatever you're talking about, has to have this physical vessel, this what you would term, I guess, under this system of opposites, like a solar vessel to actually speak about. Likewise with the dimensions. I look at the universe, the three-dimensional observable reality around us. All of this, it has length, width, and depth. And I say, is there any end to the space not necessarily occupied, but capable of being occupied by matter and energy? I argue no. I argue that the third dimension, regardless of the form and shape and size of the observable universe as we know it, goes on forever. I also argue that it doesn't particularly matter whether there is a mechanistic system behind this or a cosmic sort of divine hand helping things along. In other words, it doesn't really matter if there's a god or not, or some divine intelligent force or not. If the system is limitless, if it is infinite, then we are not living in a deterministic reality. There's also no uniqueness to the ego, and there's no specific reason why when your physical body dies, you wouldn't simply jump somewhere else on the fourth dimension, which is simply an infinite magnitude higher than this one. There's no specific reason you wouldn't be able to do that, because your consciousness isn't unique. It's also reserved on the higher dimensions, and potentially, by the way, the lower dimensions. If you regard the second dimension as a series, an infinite number of infinitely thin sort of sheets that permeate this existence, then any thought that you have, any form that you take, any action that you undertake is forming an infinitely large reality to the perspective of any being that would be living on that lower dimension. You are actually continuously spawning a very large number of realities, which intrinsically include you in them. In fact, you are the entirety of that reality. Your actual physical form or mental form or whatever is actually creating that infinitely large reality. Because remember, that second dimension is infinitely larger than the first. And I imagine that these points simply repeat over and over and over forever in both directions. That is, the first dimension and the third dimension are only differentiated insofar as we regard them. But to a being living on the first dimension, theirs would seem essentially like this one, and ours would seem like a brutally magnificent abstract that is simply so much larger in size they can't comprehend it. Any dimension lower than your own is technically an arbitrary placeholder with no value that does not exist. Any dimension higher is also arbitrary. It's infinitely larger. But to somebody in that reality, if indeed there are physical beings therein, ours would be an arbitrary placeholder with no actual existence. It would be an abstract because it has no linear existence within that fourth dimension. And I imagine it, somebody speeding around the corner about to skid into a snowbank, I imagine it as if we regard the first dimension as an infinitely small point. That is, I mean, an infinitely long line, but with no actual depth or height. The second dimension is a sheet. It still lacks that same depth. Now, to our mind, those two dimensions are basically identical because they're both arbitrary. They each have at least one dimension which doesn't exist, which means for our purposes, they don't exist. And yet one is infinitely larger than the other. Well, how can this be? It's a mathematical paradox. I envision it as being a series of zeros and ones. Any dimension lower than yours has an arbitrary value of 0. That is, that the lower dimension doesn't really exist. It's arbitrary to your eyes. The higher dimension above yours has the arbitrary value of 1. That is, that it encompasses one whole, comprised of all the possible permutations of your own. Your dimension, that is, for us, the third, simply involves infinitely small decimals between 0 and 1. That would involve all of our finite mathematics, because no matter how many numbers you throw in, 0.9999 and so forth, you will never approach that 1. And no matter how small you go, you're not actually able to approach zero either. These are arbitrary sums, and you are simply dealing with the finite totals between them. Now, in the occult, this has additional meaning, because in the occult, this indicates that, mathematically speaking, at least, there is no particular uniqueness to this particular dimension. It's just one of a number. Now, these could be finite, but when I look at the infinite expanse possible within mathematics, when I look at the infinite number of possible realities, when I look at the infinite expanse probably of our own dimension, I say, ultimately, it looks more like everything really adds up to a combination of nothingness and everythingness, and that these finite calculations that we make ultimately only make sense within our own finite mathematics. They're very good for quantifying finite objects that we observe. They're very poor at quantifying infinite things. In fact, we can't quantify them. They're nonsensical within our mathematical systems. Thus, the dimension higher than ours is arbitrarily infinitely larger than our own. The one below is arbitrarily infinitely smaller, and yet they still exist. And a being within those dimensions would regard ours either as infinitely large or small, and their own as being finite. And they would imagine, no matter how much they actually observe within their universe, whatever form it may take, no matter how much they observe, they can only observe a nearly infinitely small amount of it, because they can never truly observe it all, because it's infinite to them in size. It's also infinite in time to their minds as well, or nearly infinite. They think of things in terms of finite calculations. And yet the one above them, they will say, is infinitely large, and the one below infinitely small. And they will say that the ones below them, to their minds, don't really exist, and the ones above exist for an infinite period of time as well. Time being that, again, arbitrary concept, which really only regards whatever dimension happens to come above yours. It's another arbitrary measurement. I know I'm getting a little bit off topic here. Also, cycles are another thing that I regard. When I look at the world, I say there are a great number of seemingly mechanical cycles that govern this world. I note, for instance, the lunar cycle closely approximates the growing systems of plants. Like, there are an awfully large number of plants that reach full maturity from being planted in either 2 or 3 or 4 lunar cycles. Now, this doesn't seem to make sense. It should be the solar cycle ultimately that they're working with, but rather we see things that mature in like 120 days in a temperate climate, which has really no regards for season as far as the sun goes, and it really appears to have more to do with the lunar cycle. And only the fact that these two are intrinsically interconnected makes us look at it, and it makes it seem as though the solar cycle plays a part. There's another going trend within the New Age, and I think also now within science to some degree as well, or at least fringe science, to talk about how these mood disorders and insomnia and all of these problems don't really deal with how much sunlight you get. It has to do with how much dark you get, because it sort of allows the pineal gland to express itself, because it is photosensitive. That is actually true. And that it's actually the lack of light more than the presence of light that matters. Well, this is another lunar feminine system. Is it any wonder that these New Age groups, whether you're talking about more authentic like Eastern spirituality, or more modern day like, the Illuminati, the New World Order stuff, is it any small wonder that the sort of psychic spiritual beings are said to inhabit a subterranean world where there is no sunlight? This appears to make a statement, again, regards to this pineal gland, or something along those lines, or some abstract concept that we can quantify thereof as being part of the pineal gland. I haven't seen anybody else mention this fact, that sort of tale holds true. And of course, Shambhala, or the Illuminati world, or the above-ground sort of solar kingdoms, or whatever you want to term these groups within sort of the Atlantean sort of crystal gazing stuff, are above ground. They're places you've sort of got a metaphor going on, not just about the sun itself, the actual solar power that's coming down from the sun, or the solar deity or whatever, but almost a statement about light in illumination, not literal and physical, but metaphorical as well, like the illumination of secular knowledge, of physical, worldly knowledge. And so there's a lot of material here, and of course I'm not anywhere near done writing it, so there will be probably more to come, and I'll probably make other videos as I go on through, because when I write, I have the tendency to sort of sit there and almost write automatically, filling the pages with the stuff that I know about the occult or whatever. It doesn't require a great deal of research because I've already studied these things for so long that my mind simply siphons its own content, sort of puts it on the pages, and then afterwards, of course, because I tend to go off on rants and tangents, I have to take these sections and like recompile them so they actually make sense. That's the major weakness I have when writing, is that I tend to rant just as I do when I'm speaking. But all of these concepts are important within the occult. The main idea, though, is simply that the idea that the masculine and feminine, or light and dark, or any of these other opposites apply beyond the biological, beyond that same physical which they imagine the solar regards, is a little bit strange, because you need both in order to have them act on one another. It's like the feminine energy of the moon. I'll give one last example here. They say, well, the solar represents the physical manifestations. The moon is more, you know, it's feminine and etheric and spiritual. Well, the moon also influences the tides. That's a very physical, cyclical process that happens in this world. And it's influenced predominantly by our lunar body, by the moon. This is not a spiritual aspect at all. This is a very physical, cyclical process that goes on with these tides. It also gives life to these coastal regions. It renews them. It deposits detritus both in the water and on the land. It feeds all of the creatures that are there. This is a very physical, a very hylic process. And yet they would say, within their realm of the occult, they would say that the moon only regards spiritual things. It's the sun that regards the physical and the masculine energy. And yet here we have the moon responsible for this tidal force, which, by the way, also keeps the planet's core molten and prevents us from all dying. And yet here's the other funny thing. Volcanism and seismology, typically in pagan lore, those beings are also regarded as male beings, and yet it is the moon that is actually indirectly causing them. And they ascribe to the moon this sort of feminine force. All of these cultures, when they look at the lunar body, they imagine it to be feminine. I don't know, maybe the light's more gentle and it's more pale and nocturnal, and so they just imagine that it's like a woman. And yet it's causing these effects on the planet that they identify as male. Even the concept of Poseidon as the lord of the sea in Greek mythology, which would deal with things like the tides, that is affected by the moon, by what they imagine as a feminine force. The idea of underwater springs, things like that. Poseidon in Athenian mythology, I think Athens, the city of Athens. It ended up getting named after the goddess Athena when she planted, I believe, a couple of olive trees there, and her and Poseidon had a disagreement. They both wanted to be the patron deity of this city. Poseidon hits the ground with his trident and a spring comes up, but it's like salt water, and so it's unpalatable. You have this sort of male gift. And yet, and Athena ultimately gets chosen because they like the olives better than this brackish water that comes out of the ground. And yet that same spring would have been caused by those same volcanic or seismic forces, endemic, of course, greatly in that region, which come from this female energy. And part of this is they didn't quite understand how these things worked, although they could have just observed the lunar cycle and the tidal cycle and seen where they interlock. That's the other thing. All of these cycles interlock with one another. They move in a mechanical fashion. That's not to say that determinism is correct. In fact, I now deny determinism. I was flirting with it before, but now I can say I no longer believe that determinism is correct, because I have to make a distinction. If our physical reality is infinite in size, determinism, it seems to me, cannot be true, because you have a true randomized system. It's not a closed system. It's a completely open system with a technically infinite amount of matter and energy in it. Determinism can't exist. Unless, by the way, you have a cosmic force guiding it. And if it is finite, then determinism seems to make more sense, because you do have that closed system. These things can operate upon one another in a mechanical fashion. I use an allusion to like gears. If you only have 2 or 3 gears working in tandem, it's very easy to quantify it. It's very easy to tell that it's a mechanical device. And you can say, well, if we fully understand how these 3 gears work in regards to one another, and it wouldn't take long to do that, we can eventually get to the point where we can predict exactly what readout it will give at any given time, because we know how those gears work. But if you have a machine that has 1 trillion gears, and they operate upon different sort of mechanisms, and they affect one another in strange ways, it may be impossible for you to ever quantify that that's not simply spitting out completely random numbers. You may theorize that it's not, because inside you know it's made of gears, you know it's mechanical, you know it moves in predictable ways. However, it may be impossible for you to understand its movements fully because it's too convoluted. What we need to determine, and this is all we have to do, is look at existence and either theorize or tell for sure whether we're dealing with a mechanism which is gigantic but so convoluted that it seems randomized, or whether we're dealing with a truly open system where there is true randomization, because it is infinitely convoluted. We have to determine whether it's just massively convoluted but ultimately finite or not. And this would be a question, I think, for science more than the occult, because the occult will simply spawn an opinion. I am of the opinion that our physical realm, that our third dimension, is infinite in size. It does not have borders. There are an infinite number of universes. They're probably arranged into some higher arrangement than universes, and there are an infinite number of those clusters as well. I envision them as being similar to atomic structure. This may or may not be correct. I don't believe that there's any limit. I also believe that there's a limitless amount of everything in the universe. There's no such thing as a finite number in reality, except where we're regarding objects in a finite manner. It's again an arbitrary system. I know that this video is dense, and it would require many videos of this length to fully explain. That's why I'm writing a book on the subject rather than just speaking on it. But it's an interesting one nonetheless. The nature of reality itself is intrinsic to the occult, and the idea that the moon and the sun or any of these other things are opposing forces, I think, is wrong. I think they are simply totals, and you're simply looking at arbitrary terms that are given to these phenomena. The same way that I've spoken out, by the way, many times now, against the idea of labeling magic as white magic or black magic, and then they have sort of gray magic in the middle. No, it's all gray magic. There is no, you're trying to give it terms like good or bad, and really, these terms don't exist outside of your own subjective opinion. What one culture considers a good use of magic, some other culture would consider a bad use, and vice versa. So what's the point of even applying these labels to this phenomenon? You're simply assuming that one religious philosophical school, Christianity, Wicca, whatever, is correct in its moral observations, and then applying them to something that doesn't even necessarily fully encompass that same philosophical system. This is where I differ from a lot of other occultists, a lot of them. They cloister themselves in one specific occult school. They pretend to have a great deal of wisdom. Ultimately, their wisdom is lacking. Because they simply use these same dichotomous opposing terms. And they use it in their own practice, thus limiting their own capabilities. They don't look at things as a sum total, and so they sort of take things and put them off limits to their own practice. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But yeah, I know that's dense, but it is how it is. That's about all. Peace out.